thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. Happy New Year! It's January 2020, and you're listening to episode 155, which is about the Terrence Malick film, A Hidden Life, which is in theaters now. On this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Philip Talon, who is an assistant professor of theology at Houston Baptist University, where he chairs the Apologetics department and also teaches in the Honors College. Phil has written an online exclusive film review for the Christian Research Journal, and it's called The Marathon of Martyrdom, a review of A Hidden Life, and you can read it for free online at our website, equip.org. Phil, it's good to have you on.
Oh, very glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's good to have Phil on 2 weeks in a row. It's kind of movie season. This particular film is kind of an art house film. It's written and directed by the well-regarded Terrence Malick, and some of our listeners may not know that much about him. He made some films in the 1970s, but he basically burst back into cinematic consciousness with the film The Thin Red Line back in 1988. And even earlier in his career, he taught philosophy at MIT. So his work is always characterized by philosophical and sometimes religious themes. He explores themes like love, God, and suffering in some of his more recent films, The Tree of Life and To the Wonder. And some of our listeners might like to read our review of To the Wonder, which is available free online at our website, equip.org. So this particular film, A Hidden Life, gets its title from a novel called Middlemarch, which was written in the 1870s by a writer named George Eliot, which was actually a pen name for a woman who was a writer named Mary Ann Evans. And the quote is this: "For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who live faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." This film, A Hidden Life, tells the story of Franz Jägerstätter.
Jägerstätter?
Yes, Jägerstätter. I have some friends from Germany staying with me right now. And who was Franz, and why was his story important enough for this film to have this treatment on the big screen? And how does the title apply to him in particular?
Yeah, well, Franz Jägerstätter was a real Austrian martyr. He lived a fairly hidden life, as it were, up in the Alpine region of Austria. He was a farmer and had a biography that was in many ways unremarkable. He was a bit of a wild youth. He, seemed to have, some bearing and presence at one point. They tried to elect him mayor of the town, but he refused. He married, had 3 daughters with his wife, and then, as we are all aware, Austria was drawn into Germany's war campaign, and became essentially kind of a puppet of the German war effort. And as the pressure to serve in the war ramped up, like many faithful Christians in Germany and Austria at the time, Franz felt it necessary to resist. And so, his village had, all voted in praise of some German act. Franz was the only no vote. When he was sent up for training, he refused to swear an oath to Hitler, and then was charged as a result of this. And basically, the film documents the period of his life, between, as the war is escalating, additional pressure is being applied to Franz to serve, and his refusal to swear the oath, which leads eventually to his arrest, trial, and it's not a huge spoiler to say his eventual execution. And so Franz Jägerstätter was not widely known or honored at the time. The village refused to put him on the war monument. His wife was not given a pension. But his story eventually came out. Many people, including Thomas Merton, had written about his story, and he was eventually beatified by the Catholic Church. He was a Catholic himself, as a saint. And so now this quiet act of heroism is being told around the world.
So I gave a little bit of information about the director, Terrence Malick. So how does this particular film fit into his body of work?
Well, Malick is an interesting director, and one that I think Christians should be aware of. Though perhaps read up on his movies before jumping in, because I think some may be more inspiring than others. But certainly for Christian viewers, a movie like The Tree of Life, which is in many ways a kind of a prolonged meditation on, say, the Book of Job, beauty of creation, as well as films like The New World, some of his earlier movies will be profoundly stirring and meaningful. He brings a lot of kind of depth of thought, and this movie I think is arguably his most explicitly Christian, but it fits a little bit unusually in the Malickian canon. Malick made a film early in the 70s, Badlands, with a young Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek. It's a beautiful film, and then made another film a bit later, Days of Heaven, and basically kind of took a prolonged hiatus where he didn't make anything for a long time, and came back with The Thin Red Line, a movie that got a lot of attention, put him back on the map in the 90s. And he's been sort of doing the reverse Kubrick. Kubrick slowed down as time went on, and Malick has been speeding up in his later years and turning out more and more films. His most recent movies before A Hidden Life have been quite impressionistic, more sort of abstract, and you might say almost stream of consciousness guided, rather than having a clear plot through line and so forth. And this film in a way signals a bit more of a return to his earlier film style, where there is a kind of a clear plot and story to be told. Though audiences be warned, this is a almost 3-hour long film where not a lot happens. The story could be told fairly quickly, but Malick is a meditative filmmaker. He's a philosophical filmmaker, and part of the point is to sit with and kind of live with the difficult consequences of choosing the tough path of martyrdom. And so we get to see the beauties of Franz's life. Malick is a wonderful filmmaker for his attention to detail, and we see all of the intricate aspects of what it means to be a farmer, and how you cut and bundle wheat and thresh it, and all of the steps in that. We see his his family, we see his village life, and then we see, of course, how things are seemingly inevitably leading to his eventual death as a result of his faithful witness. And so we feel the pain, as it were, of him sacrificing these things, because we spent so much time with these beauties. But then we also then live with the difficulty of his choices, as his family, suffers as a result of, missing their father, or just simply experiences the dread of waiting for that moment when he will finally get the conscription letter and be sent away. And so it's a movie whose main purpose is not to, as it were, get across a story, but to communicate an experience. And part of that experience involves a fair amount of patience and attention, and to some degree kind of pain in the process. And so it is a very Malickian film. His most explicitly religious. Malick has always had religious sensibilities that I'm not exactly sure what his theology is particularly, but this movie strikes me as being one that's profoundly informed by religious commitments.
You mentioned that the film's almost 3 hours. It's not literally real time, but it almost feels like that, just kind of in the warp and woof of, agrarian society kind of a thing. And just maybe in the slowness of it, and almost in the quietness of it, there's not a lot of dialogue, of explanation. You kind of go into it, and as everything unfolds, you start feeling maybe the anxiety, or you just waiting to see what's going to happen type of a thing. And, just this idea of, in your title, this marathon to martyrdom. It's just this long process. And I think it was a process of years. It wasn't just like happened right away. And the interesting thing too was he died near the end of the war. So it was like the war was almost over and he ended up dying. But how does Terrence Malick handle this particular topic of martyrdom?
Yeah. As often in his movies, he will sometimes, state things, quite directly. There are some theological statements in here, but often it's through images. I mean, there's a particular scene where we see Franz Jägerstätter walking, along one of his village paths, and it's kind of going kind of up and off, and he's thinking to himself about, his death, and he says that, once one has resolved to die, then one is free. And basically at the same moment, we see him pass a sort of a roadside crucifix, just a religious bit of ornamentation on the side of the road, this, kind of rough-hewn, rustic crucifix. And he pauses for a moment, kind of looks at it. And so obviously here, we have this juxtaposition of Franz's decision, to refuse to swear an oath to Hitler. He's not a coward. He's not afraid to serve in the war, but he won't, swear this oath. And so he knows that, his path will very likely lead him to his death, and that he is, with Christ in this way. And so we have a number of points where, Malick is, looking, as it were, at Franz's decision in these religious terms. We also have a later really lovely moment after Franz has been captured and put in prison, where he's speaking with one of his buddies from his army training very early on, this kind of lighthearted fellow, and his friend begins to talk about what it must be like to have your head cut off by the guillotine. And he says, they put you down and the blade comes down and your head comes off, and then it's no longer on your body. And then he kind of lifts his hands up and he says, and you're free. He's thinking about, the afterlife. He's thinking about the freedom, as it were, that lies on the far side of this incarceration. And the gateway to move from one to the other is through his death. And so we have almost, the words of Scripture there, that in Hebrews, that, for the joy set before him, Jesus suffered the cross, scorning its shame. It's not as if martyrdom is merely a kind of a hopeless, act of defiance. This is a profoundly hopeful movie, not overly optimistic. There's still some struggling with kind of doubt. Why does God allow this to happen? But it's still a deeply Christian meditation on martyrdom, and shows that in order to, as it were, kind of faithfully follow Christ, it really involves the commitment of one's entire life. And so it's not just simply a single rash moment that enables Franz to do this. He can turn back at any point. And so again and again, we see people come to Franz and say, look, just say the oath, this isn't going to do any good. No one will know. And, don't you know this won't do any good? And many people say this. His priest says this. His mother says this. His army lawyer says this. All these folks give him the same advice. And so it'd be the kind of thing that I think most of us put in that situation, would have a very difficult time imagining bearing up under the pressure of this, and at any moment you could basically kind of go along and be freed from this, go off and serve in the war, perhaps die there, but, at the very least you'd have a chance of returning home. But, Franz resolves, and his wife is with him in that, in that resolve. And eventually his mother comes around to see the wisdom in this. And so, Malick is talking about as it were, the virtue of patience and perseverance required for Christian living. But he also, I think this is what's particularly interesting, artistically helps us practice a little bit of that through the medium of his film, which requires of us patience and perseverance and sort of sitting there and bearing the difficulty of his choices.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Dr. Phil Tellen, who has written an online exclusive film review for the Christian Research Journal, and his review is called The Marathon of Martyrdom, a film review of A Hidden Life. You can read Phil's review free online at our website, equip.org. We'd like to invite you to subscribe to the Christian Research Journal. A subscription is $33.50, and to subscribe, go to our website, equip.org. If a subscription is not in your budget right now, we'd like to ask you to help spread the word about this podcast. Maybe you can tell a friend about it, share this episode on your social media accounts, or even more helpful would be to go to wherever you get your podcasts and write a review or provide a star review for this podcast. Give us feedback there, and it would really help spread the word about this content, which is free. And we'd like to ask you to help keep this content free by either considering a subscription or maybe tipping us for our content. You can tip us for our content by going to our website, go to Postmodern Realities Podcast, click on the landing page for this episode or any episode, and you'll find a link there where you can give us a tip for $3, $5, $10, maybe the cost of what it is to see a movie, and help us be able to continue to bring this podcast to you. And thank you. Well, it's kind of interesting, I think, in this film to see how maybe Franz's faith is contrasted maybe with church officials as well. They have a local Roman Catholic priest, and he does go higher up to ask for help from the area bishop as well. And so it's interesting to see how they perhaps are insinuated or suggested rather that they're using means of self-preservation, whereas Franz seems that has this deep conviction and he's this simple person, and that's what's quite interesting. And it also is interesting to see how a nation's, or actually a whole area, so it's, Austria, and the influence of Hitler and his ideas come down even to the smallest local of levels. So this movie does, through his conviction, more explicitly deal with Christian themes than some of his other films. I mean, they're suggested in his other films, but I think some of the dialogue are actual prayers. It does seem more explicitly Christian to me. So what are some of the theological ideas that Malick is communicating here?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the most prominent place where, as it were, theology comes into it is through the presence of the church and through these religious figures. And there, we do understand that, as it were, the Catholic Church presented here, of which France is a part, though it's, very much true of the German Protestant Church as well, very often went along with the sort of Nazi plan. And so, of course, there are figures who stood up against this. There was a confessing movement against Nazism, and, people like Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer are notable examples of this. Barth helped to write the Barmen Declaration, which, stated, as it were, that the church in no way required the authorization of the state to do its work. It rests exclusively on the confession of Jesus Christ and his being sent into the world and his revelation of God's person. And so, Barth mailed that confession to Hitler personally. There were many people who did stand up, but as is often the case in human life, we kind of get caught up in the institutions and structures around us, and and have a difficult time sort of separating ourselves in key moments. And this is not nothing only exclusive to Germans, though it's a just particularly dire and extreme example that makes it kind of clear how necessary this can be at times. And so this is a running theme, though it's not one that Malick has much to say about, except to show that this is an issue that beset the church even then. Probably the more significant theological themes have to do with creation and the problem of evil, which is a perennial theme for Malick, or at least one that he takes up as well in The Tree of Life, which is a meditation, as it were, on creation, the experience of being in creation, and the kind of the choice that's before humans, which is, are we going to, as it were, follow the way of nature, which is to say, to kind of be self-seeking, to do what benefits us, or are we going to follow the way of grace, which, is really, for Malick, kind of equivalent with agape. And so there's this sort of struggle, and we live in the sort of the tension, as it were, of being kind of fallen, sinful creatures, in a world, though, that is good and beautiful. And so in A Hidden Life, we have, these idyllic scenes. There's a beautiful world that has been given to the characters. We see at the beginning, I think it's the first scene, see Franz, he's cutting grass with his scythe out there in the field. A little later, after he's married, we see him out there with his wife. They're both cutting together, and so it's almost like a creation account. We have Adam, and then later he's given a helper to be with him. It's not good for him to be alone, and the two of them are together. And the problem of evil is something that his wife deals with. Notably, she's kind of wondering, why does God allow these things to happen toward the end of the movie? But she also has a confidence that, in the light of heaven, her questions will be answered. And so, the age-old questions that humans have asked, that the book of Job asks, that most of us will struggle with is, how do we make sense of so much evil in a world that God has made? And Malick, I think, deals with these issues in a way that's intriguing and provide a rich context for thought. He doesn't resolve very much. He's certainly not a preachy filmmaker, and will often kind of have tensions bound up in his movies. He'll enable us to feel, as it were, both the hope and the doubt that people experience, and we have that in the Tree of Life, and we have that here. And so I think it's a very rich text for us to kind of think and talk about these issues, if not a one that needs to resolve everything perfectly at the end.
So how could the Christian apologist use A Hidden Life, this film, as a springboard to talk about Christianity?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good text for people to use to talk about, what are the ways that we, as it were, compromise our Christian witness by going along with things that, the world wants us to think. And so that could be any range of things, and so that's probably the most valuable place to begin, because, looking at Malick's film, it's sort of set in a different place and time, but I think we can see in ourselves, some points of comparison, times when our kind of conscience suggests, hey, I think this is actually wrong, and I shouldn't be kind of going along with this, but there's pressure to do so, and everybody else seems to be fine with it. So, what's the harm in just going along here? Franz and his wife are, really loners and outsiders. And so it shows that, we can't rely on the wisdom of the crowd very often in order to know what the right thing is to do. We all think that, standing up and refusing to swear an oath to Hitler, I think most of us do, is the right thing, and perhaps even the required thing. And so it really sharpens the point and can, potentially sort of help us to be more bold in taking our moral stands and refusing to be complicit with wicked, worldly structures. And I think that's potentially very valuable. It's also a film that, really helps us to count the true price of discipleship. And so at the beginning of my piece, I quoted Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he talked about costly grace. And this is anybody who's read The Cost of Discipleship will be familiar with this distinction he makes between cheap grace and costly grace. And Bonhoeffer, definitely wants to emphasize that God's salvation is grace. It is nothing that we could earn. It is a gift. Yet it also has profound life-changing implications for who we are, and grace that says, no, you don't ever really, need to change, or this, just kind of, you're fine the way that you are, and leaves us unchanged is really a cheapened version of what salvation truly entails. And so I think, living in a very comfortable, society, largely not faced with very kind of difficult choices, not actively persecuted, certainly not mortally persecuted. We can forget the real cost of following Jesus and the cost that following Jesus has for many people around the world. And this movie brings that home in a powerful way.
So this film, A Hidden Life, is showing in a few theaters in major markets. So is it something that people need to try and track down and see on the big screen? Is this one of those kinds of films that is better on the big screen as opposed to your iPhone or your tablet?
Yes, it is. All Malick is worth seeing on the big screen. Though this one it's one that I think anybody who is interested in what you might call Christian cinema and who wants to encourage more movies that are, profoundly informed by faith, that are, good. I don't recall any. There's not even much violence in the film. It's a fairly family friendly film. Check the internet for content warnings, but it's a movie that I think many people could watch in good conscience. And so if you've ever bemoaned the lack of good Christian cinema or faith infused movies, but let this one pass by, then shame on you, because this is, I think, a movie that we should go out and support. And it's absolutely at the top notch artistically, as well as profoundly theological. And so it's the sort of thing that I would like to promote. So go, if you're instead of going to see Rise of Skywalker for the second time, go and see A Hidden Life. It seems to be kind of shown in major markets, and sort of in kind of a bit of a dribble. So it is showing a couple of days a few weeks ago, and now a couple of days again this week at the the art house cinema here. And so if you check your listings, you can definitely find it. But go see it, because you really want the big kind of sweeping panorama of the Austrian Alpine mountains. You want to see these sites on the big screen. And I think also it's a movie that really rewards sitting through in one viewing. And it's a little harder to do that if you're at home. You tend to pause and go up and go get something to drink, or go make some popcorn, or do something else, or check your phone. And this movie is a good movie just to sit and meditate with for 2 hours and 50 minutes.
I definitely think that the film, I watched the trailer, and then after I saw the trailer and the vistas are so beautiful, I just thought, this is something you need to see on the big screen. And actually, I think it captures the beauty well. One thing about Austria, if anyone's ever been to Austria, is if you look out on some of the Austrian vistas, it looks fake. It's so pretty. You're there in real life, and you're like, this looks fake. It doesn't even look real. So it's just, I think it captures it even better than seeing it in real life, which is kind of amazing, because it just has this particular beauty to it that just seems very unreal. Like it seems photoshopped or something, but you're just looking at it. So I highly recommend as well someone to go and do something different. I think a lot of times many Christians also get caught up, and there's nothing wrong with that, in some of the big spectacle Marvel films or some of the films with CGI, and we don't tend to watch some of the more contemplative films in the big screen, but this is one worth seeking out for sure, even if you have to drive a ways to go to your next local large city so that you can see it. Well, finally, I want to end with some fun rapid fire questions for Phil. So it's a new year, Phil. How did you ring in the new year? Do you watch the ball drop every year with your family?
No, we set our kitchen analog clock forward 2 hours, and then celebrate the new year at 10 p.m. and then go to bed. We rarely do we do anything terribly exciting. So we had a very quiet, though joyful New Year's celebration with our family, and got a good night's sleep.
Well, lots of people make health resolutions at this time of year. So is there any kind of exercise or workouts or healthy eating that you do?
I am currently training for a half marathon. I would like to. My big resolution is to keep up with my training. I like being able to just sort of go knock out about a 10K just on a weekday without too much difficulty. And so I'm intending to keep this up, though I'm not resolving to do so. I'm just intending to do so.
And we've been talking about films for the last couple of weeks. This week, A Hidden Life. Last week, The Rise of Skywalker. So what other film that you saw in 2019 do you think that everyone should put on their watch list?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm suddenly drawing a blank. I have a number of, kind of favorite movies. Let me recommend something from a few years ago, but it's one that I think people have not seen enough and should check out. There's a filmmaker named Whit Stillman, who has also has some Christian sensibilities. And he made a movie a few years ago called Love and Friendship, which is an adaptation of an early Jane Austen work. And it's utterly charming and beautifully made and worth revisiting if you haven't seen it. And Whit Stillman is a filmmaker I adore and would like to make more movies. And so I encourage people to see all the Whit Stillman films they can.
And that's kind of a fun film as well because it has in one of the lead roles Kate Beckinsale, and normally she's in like video game adaptation movies or those kind of action films. So it's very different to see her in this period piece. So I do recommend it. It's a good one, and I think it's streaming that people can easily find it. So Phil, it's great to have you on the Postmodern Realities podcast. Thanks for being on.
Oh, very glad to be here.
You've been listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest has been Dr. Phil Talon. He has written an online exclusive film review for the Christian Research Journal. You can read it completely free at our website, equip.org, and his review is called The Marathon of Martyrdom, a film review of A Hidden Life, which is in theaters right now. We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media, like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page, and follow CRI, Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. And please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes, and please rate and review our podcast. When you rate and review our podcast, it helps others see our content. And please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged, Hank's audio podcast. Follow Hank Off the Grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast.